The reason that I wanted to teach my students in my app development class how to use CoreData was that many of them were getting to the point in some of the apps that they were designing that they wanted to save information, and they didn't want it to disappear every time the app was closed. And so CoreData is a library that's built into iOS that makes it really easy once it's set up to kind of do that. Now, CoreData is kind of a monster in terms of getting it set up, especially for someone who has never done anything with Swift programming, and many of my students haven't coded before, and I like giving them a way in that isn't too intimidating, that starts with some code that does one thing and then gives students the opportunity to kind of hack it and modify it to do something else. So I created a file that was kind of a starting point for CoreData that my students could use. And to download that file, go to the description just below this video, and you'll be able to access that file and download it yourself. Once you download that file, open up the zip file, and you'll see these various components of the project. You're going to go to the models file. You can see right here, and just sort of follow along. So what I was thinking as an example app was to try to make it so that you could store information about books. So what information do we want to store about books? Well, probably the title, the author, and maybe the year of publication. When I work with students on this, I have them think about the data that they want to store and what are the different elements of a single piece of data. And so we call this a model, and that's why I've given it the name model over here. So let's name these three properties. Property 1 will change to title, property 2 will change to author, and property 3, I will write this just as maybe year of publication. So we'll leave that as year. So now that I have done this, I'm going to select the model, go over here, change this to manual none, or make sure that it's on manual none. I'm going to go to editor, create NS-managed object subclass. So there's a couple steps here. Just save that into the main directory, give it a second, and right here you can see that there are a whole bunch of errors, 15 of them. But by adding these files, what I'm doing is creating in code a little structure that stores the title of a book, author, and year. And so that prepares CoreData to be able to store those three pieces of information for each book that I want to enter. I used those really vague labels of property 1, property 2, and property 3 throughout this project. And the reason I did that is that I wanted to make it fairly easy using find and replace to change the name everywhere in this project to match this model that was being used. Because you may have a different application, a different kind of information that you want to store within your app. So what we're going to do to make it really easy is we're going to go to find and then find and replace in project. And everywhere in the project that property 1 appears, I'm going to put in the title. So if I go up here and hit enter, you see that property 1 pops up a bunch of times, and I'm just going to replace all of those mentions with title. So I'm going to do that there. Change that to property 2. Property 2 was author. So I'll go through and again replace all those. And then property 3 was the year, so I'm going to replace that with year. All right, there is one other thing that I'm going to suggest that you do. You'll notice that we have these question marks here next to string. This has to do with an idea in the Swift programming language called optionals, and we don't actually need those three to be optionals. It makes something that will pop up a little bit later a little messier than it needs to be, and it's not that important that we deal with it right now. So delete those 3 question marks. And so at this stage, I have one other thing that I just want to show, and that is that this right here is the code that runs when the application first opens up, and I make it so that the first time you run this app, there's no data saved in CoreData, so it adds some. And there's this function called add test data, which I have defined down here, which just creates some books. It has some titles, 4 of them, the corresponding authors, and the corresponding publishing years. And what the program does is creates a model for each of these books, and then it uses CoreData to actually store each of those models into the CoreData system. You don't need to get bogged down in the details of how this works right now. Just get a sense of the fact that we want this app to open up with some data that we can play around with. So let's run this app and see how it works in the simulator. So when the app eventually loads, you can see that we now have our 4 test books visible within the simulator. And I've built some of the functionality in here where if we click on one of these, we can actually edit these. So if I go in here, maybe I want to change that and into an ampersand, I can do that. I can hit save, and that is updated within CoreData. Now, CoreData is special. It's different from other systems because it is persistent, and that means if I leave the app like this and I go back into it, my change is still there. And that's not the case if you store data just within memory without using something like CoreData. We can also add a new book. So let's try that functionality here. You'll notice when I click on the plus button, I have the ability to enter title, author, and year. So let's add in another book. Let's put in app development with Swift. Author, we'll just put Apple, and year 2017 is when that happened. So if I hit save, we now see that book added to our list, and if we click on it, we can again edit everything. And this, you might wonder why I don't force the students from the start to start going through all of the elements of code and figuring out how it works. And that's just kind of the principle I've been using in my class, where I want to give them something that allows them to create something with code. And then once they've created something with code and it works for them, then they can kind of get into the details and understand a little bit behind how it works as they want to change it into doing something else. For example, you'll notice that I stored the year as a string. You may not want to store the year as a string, or maybe you want to make it so that if students are storing number of points that a particular basketball player has scored, you may want to sort according to the number of points, which makes a lot more sense to store that information as an integer. And so then you get into the conversations around how the code works and how you handle things like that. So this has so far served as a really good starting point, and I hope it works for you as well to get an idea of how to use CoreData to work for you. Thanks for watching.